Close-up of Bree's calm face. Cutting to Tristan laughing and pointing at her, I gave him exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes of Tristan pointing at my cheap vintage car like it was a pile of scrap metal, and mocking my red dress in front of the city's wealthiest investors. He even handed me a handful of loose change, telling me it was for the bus ride home since my junk was officially being towed. The chandeliers begin to rattle. A massive black shadow covers the ballroom floor then. The ground starts to shake. I watched the smug grin slide right off Tristan's face as the windows rattled and a black military helicopter descended toward the terrace. Because a Mafia billionaire doesn't wait for the valet. And Tae Hyung was about to show Tristan the literal price of disrespecting his wife. Brief flash of Tae Hyung stepping out of the helicopter. His dragon tattoo visible, but before I show you the moment Tae bought the entire venue just to have Tristan thrown out by his own security, let me tell you why I almost let the ghosts of my past win. Like and subscribe to see how this power play ends, and comment below with the city you're watching from. I'm reading every single one to see how far our story is traveling today. Soft sunlight in a luxury penthouse. Bree is throwing a gold-lettered card into a trash bin 3 days ago. I threw that invitation into the trash. It was expensive cardstock with gold lettering that practically screamed, "Look how much better we are than you." 10-year reunion. Grand Lotus Hotel. Black tie optional. I looked at it once, felt my stomach do a slow, painful flip, and decided I'd rather eat glass than see Tristan again. Tae Hyung's hand reached into the trash, pulling out the card and smoothing it on a marble counter, but Tae found it that evening. He pulled it from the coffee grounds without a word, smoothed out the wrinkles, and set it on the counter between us. His voice was neutral, but I knew him well enough to hear the challenge underneath. "You aren't going there to hide, Bree. You're going there to show them exactly what they lost." The morning of the gala didn't begin with a roar of helicopter blades or the cold weight of gold-threaded silk. It began with the silence of a kitchen that felt too large for the woman standing in the center of it. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse, dancing off the marble surfaces and making the view of the Han River look like a postcard from a life I still struggled to believe was mine. But my eyes weren't on the view. They were fixed on the crumpled piece of expensive cardstock sitting at the bottom of the trash bin, partially covered by coffee grounds. My hands were shaking. It was a familiar rhythmic tremor, the kind that usually signaled a panic attack or a memory I wasn't ready to face. Even after 3 years, the ghost of Tristan Cole had a way of reaching through the luxury I now lived in to remind me of the girl who used to count pennies for bread while he spent our rent money on his mistresses. The invitation was a masterpiece of arrogance. 10-year high school reunion. Grand Lotus Hotel. Black tie optional. To anyone else it was a social event. To me, it was a summons to a trial where I had already been found guilty of being not enough. I didn't hear Tae Hyung enter the room. He moved like a shadow, efficient, silent, and predatory. It wasn't until I felt the sudden, grounding presence of him standing behind me that I realized I had been holding my breath. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached into the bin with a gloved hand and pulled out the invitation. I flinched, a reflex from a previous life that I hated myself for. I noticed. His eyes, usually as cold and impenetrable as obsidian, softened for a fraction of a second before hardening into a sharp, focused intensity. He set the crumpled card on the counter and began to smooth it out. He did it with the same meticulous care he used when cleaning his weapons. Slow, deliberate, and final. Every wrinkle he flattened felt like he was pressing down on the jagged edges of my own anxiety. "You're shaking, Bree," he said. His voice was a low, neutral hum that vibrated in the air between us. It wasn't a question, and it certainly wasn't an expression of pity. Tae Hyung didn't do pity. He viewed it as a waste of time, a sentiment that only weakened the person receiving it. "I'm fine," I lied, tucking my hands behind my back. I don't see the point in going. They're vultures, Tae. Tristan will be there with whatever trophy wife he's replaced me with, and everyone will look at me and see the woman who lost everything. I'd rather eat glass than give him the satisfaction of seeing me again." Tae stopped smoothing the paper. He looked up, his gaze locking onto mine with a force that made it impossible to look away. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to coil tighter as he stepped into my space, forcing me to tilt my head back. "You think he wants to see you?" Tay asked, his voice dropping an octave. "He doesn't want to see you. He wants to see the version of you he broke. He wants to see the girl who hides in the trash, the girl who is afraid of a piece of paper." He picked up the invitation, now perfectly flat, and pressed it into my palm. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the chilling authority in his words. "You aren't going there to be his victim again, Bree. You aren't going there to explain yourself or to seek his approval." He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over my ear. "You're going there to bury that version of yourself. You're going to let them see exactly what they lost, and then you're going to walk away while their world burns. I'll be there, but I won't be in the room. Not at first. I want you to look him in the eye and realize that he is a small man playing a small game." He stepped back, already turning toward the door as his phone buzzed with the business of a man who moved mountains and silenced enemies. "Wear the red dress," he added over his shoulder. "The one that looks simple. Let them think you're struggling. Let them get comfortable in their cruelty. It makes the fall so much more spectacular." I looked down at the card in my hand. The shaking hadn't stopped, but the nature of it had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the first spark of a cold, quiet rage. Tay was right. It was time to bury the girl I used to be. The Grand Lotus Hotel loomed over the city like a monument to excess, its glass facade shimmering under 1,000 artificial lights. As I steered my vintage car into the sweeping circular driveway, the engine gave a rhythmic metallic hum, a sound that felt dangerously out of place amidst the silent, purring engines of the Lamborghinis and Maybachs surrounding me. My car was a relic, its deep midnight blue paint covered in a thin, intentional layer of road dust. To the untrained eye, it was a ghost of a vehicle. To me, it was the first piece of the trap Tae Hyung had helped me set. I pulled up to the valet stand, where a young man in a stiff, gold-trimmed uniform stood with a clipboard. He was busy bowing to the driver of a silver Ferrari, but as his gaze drifted toward my car, his posture shifted. The professional mask of hospitality curdled into something sharper, open, jagged contempt. I rolled down the window, the evening air smelling of expensive perfume and exhaust. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. The valet didn't move to open my door. Instead, he leaned over, peering at the dashboard of my car with a sneer. "The service entrance is 2 blocks down around the corner," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "Deliveries aren't accepted at the main foyer after 6. "I'm not here to make a delivery," I replied, handing him my gold-embossed invitation. "I'm a guest for the reunion gala." He took the card with 2 fingers, as if afraid the cheapness of my arrival might be contagious. He looked at the card, then at my dusty car, then back at me. I could feel the heat rising in my neck. Even in my red silk dress, even with my hair perfectly coiffed, the old trauma shame began to wash over me like a cold tide. It was the familiar feeling of being the wrong person in the wrong room. The girl Tristan had spent years convincing that she was a blemish on his perfect world. "I can't park this here," the valet said, tossing the invitation back through the window. It fluttered onto the passenger seat. "The front row is reserved for the event sponsors and executive VIPs. You can take this to the overflow lot 3 levels down in the basement. Or," he added, his smirk growing as he caught the eye of a laughing couple behind me, "you can find a spot on the street. It might be safer there anyway." The couple behind me snickered. I recognized the woman. She had been on the cheer squad with me, a girl who used to borrow my notes and then mock my shoes behind my back. She didn't recognize me, or perhaps she chose not to, seeing only a woman in a struggling car being put in her place. "The basement will be fine," I said, my throat tight. I drove away from the lights of the foyer, descending into the dim, concrete silence of the parking garage. Each turn of the steering wheel felt like a descent back into my old life. By the time I stepped out of the car, the silence of the garage felt oppressive. I smoothed the red silk of my dress, the fabric cool against my skin, and forced myself toward the elevator. As the doors opened onto the main ballroom level, the roar of the party hit me like a physical blow. Crystal chandeliers cast a blinding, unforgiving light over hundreds of people dressed in the GDP of a small country. I stood at the edge of the room, a splash of red in a sea of black and gold. No one turned to welcome me. No one smiled. I felt small, invisible, and utterly exposed. I took a deep breath, clutching my clutch bag like a shield, and stepped onto the marble floor. I was alone, facing a sea of vultures who remembered me only as the woman who had fallen. But as I scanned the room, looking for the silhouette of the man I knew would be waiting to tear me down, I remembered Tay's voice in the kitchen. "You aren't going there to be his victim." I straightened my spine, the red silk shimmering, and began to walk. The gatekeeper had shown his scorn, but the king hadn't arrived yet. The ballroom was a sprawling landscape of opulence, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns that shimmered under the weight of a dozen massive crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume, but to me it felt suffocating. I had only taken 10 steps onto the marble floor before the crowd seemed to part, not out of respect, but like water making way for a predator. Tristan Cole appeared as if he had been haunting the entrance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He looked exactly as he did in the photos I'd spent years trying to delete, polished, expensive, and utterly devoid of soul. He wore a gray charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, and his arm was draped possessively around a woman who looked like she'd stepped off a runway, a diamond tiara nestled in her perfectly blonde hair. "Well, well," Tristan's voice boomed, cutting through the low hum of the string quartet. "Look who decided to crawl out of the shadows." He didn't wait for me to respond. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning me with a cold, clinical disdain that made my skin crawl. Within seconds, a small circle of his high society business partners drifted over, their faces expectant, sensing the blood in the water. "Gentlemen," Tristan said, gesturing toward me with a mocking flourish of his champagne flute. "I'd like you to meet Bree, my ex-wife. I'm sure you've heard the stories." I tried to give her the world, but some people are just more comfortable in the gutter. A few of the men chuckled low, polished sounds that felt like slaps to my face. I felt the old trauma shame rising, a hot prickle at the back of my neck. I wanted to tell them about the penthouse, about Tae Hyung, about the life I lived now, but the words felt stuck in my throat. Standing there, under Tristan's piercing gaze, I felt like the girl who used to cry over unpaid utility bills while he bought watches for other women. Tristan leaned in, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that reached every ear in the circle. "And look at this," he said, reaching out to rub a corner of my red silk sleeve between his thumb and forefinger. "Minimalist, right? That's the word they use for cheap these days. Did you find this in a thrift shop, Bree? Or did you have to save up for 6 months just to afford the thread?" The woman on his arm, Amber, let out a sharp, tinkling laugh. "Oh, Tristan, don't be cruel. I'm sure she tried her best. It's hard to keep up with the world when you're struggling." I looked down at the red fabric. In this light, surrounded by their heavy brocades and excessive sequins, it did look simple, almost plain. For a heartbeat, the trap Tae Hyung had set felt like it was closing on me instead of them. I felt the familiar weight of inferiority pressing down on my shoulders, whispering that Tristan was right, that I was a fraud, a little girl playing dress-up in a world I didn't belong to. Tristan's smirk widened, sensing my hesitation. He turned back to his partners, his voice full of mock pity. "She always had a taste for the authentic. I hear she's even driving some old, dusty relic tonight. I guess the bus was late, huh?" The circle laughed harder now, the sound echoing in my ears like the cawing of vultures. I tightened my grip on my clutch, my knuckles turning white. I could feel their eyes, scanning my hair, my shoes, my skin, devaluing me with every blink. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, I almost believed them. I almost believed I was still the broken woman he'd left behind. But then I felt the slight weight of the phone in my hand. I remembered the dragon tattoo on Tay's neck, and the way he had smoothed the invitation with a hand that had the power to crush empires. Tristan thought he was the alpha in this room. He thought he was the one holding the leash. He had no idea that I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the bait. I forced a small, tight smile and looked Tristan directly in the eye. "I'm glad to see you haven't changed, Tristan," I said softly. "You're still just as obsessed with labels as ever." His eyes flashed with a brief flicker of irritation before the mask of arrogance slid back into place. "Labels define the man, Bree. And right now yours says, clearance rack." He turned away, dismissing me as if I were a servant, and led his circle toward the bar. I stood there alone, the red silk of my dress feeling like fire against my skin. The first 17 minutes were starting now. Tristan wasn't satisfied with a quiet humiliation. He wanted an audience for my execution. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute, the sharp, melodic ringing cutting through the chatter of the ballroom. Slowly, the elite of the city turned their heads, drawn by the magnetism of a man they believed held the keys to their future investments. "Pardon the interruption, everyone," Tristan announced, his voice projecting with a practiced theatrical charm. He stepped closer to me, his arm still draped around Amber, who was preening under the attention. "But as many of you know, the Grand Lotus has a standard to maintain. And unfortunately, it seems a bit of street clutter has found its way into our executive parking lot tonight." He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes gleaming with a cruel, boyish delight. "Bree, I'm doing you a favor. I've noticed that blue relic you drove in, the one that looks like it's held together by rust and prayer. It's actually leaking oil onto the Italian marble foyer. It's quite an eyesore, don't you think?" A ripple of snickering moved through the crowd. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped tightly over my clutch. The trauma shame was a heavy weight in my stomach, but I kept my chin up, watching him play his hand. "I've taken the liberty of calling a tow truck," Tristan continued, his smile widening as he saw the flicker of supposed distress in my eyes. "I figured it was best to clear the space for someone who actually has a business to run. But don't worry, I'm not a monster." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of loose change. With a dramatic flourish, he grabbed my hand and pressed the cold copper coins into my palm. The metal felt heavy and filthy against my skin. "Here's for the bus ride home," he whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows of guests to hear. "Or maybe a taxi if you can find one willing to pick up someone in such a minimalist outfit. It's the least I can do for an old friend." Amber let out a sharp, high-pitched giggle, and the room followed suit. The sound was deafening, a chorus of high-society vultures picking at the carcass of my dignity. I looked down at the coins in my hand, the copper glinting under the chandeliers. To them, I was the girl who had failed, the woman who had lost the lottery of life and was now being swept away like trash. "Tristan," I said, my voice barely a whisper but carrying a strange, cold weight. "You really shouldn't have done that." "Oh, believe me, Bree, it was my pleasure," he retorted, turning back to his guests to soak in the approval of his peers. "Now, can we get back to the party? I believe the lobster is being served, and unlike some people, we actually have an appetite for the finer things." He dismissed me then, turning his back as if I had already ceased to exist. I looked at the coins one last time before slipping them into my bag. My heart was pounding, not with the fear I had felt years ago, but with the steady rhythmic pulse of a hunter waiting for the trap to spring. Tristan thought he had just towed a piece of junk. He had no idea he had just touched a $10 million prototype belonging to the most dangerous man in the city. He thought he was giving me bus fare, but he was actually paying the first installment on his own ruin. I looked at the clock on the wall. 12 minutes left. The silence I held was no longer a sign of weakness. It was the quiet before the building began to shake. I turned and walked toward the terrace, the red silk of my dress flowing behind me like a warning they were all too blind to read. The laughter from Tristan's tow truck announcement was still echoing through the ballroom when Amber glided toward me, her diamond tiara catching the light with an almost aggressive brilliance. She held a glass of deep, dark Cabernet in her hand, the liquid swirling dangerously close to the rim. There was a sharp, predatory gleam in her eyes, the look of a woman who wasn't content with just winning, but needed to see her opponent utterly erased. "Oh, Bree, I'm so sorry about your car," she cooed, though her voice lacked even a shred of sincerity. "Tristan is just so passionate about aesthetics. He simply can't help himself." She stepped into my personal space, her perfume cloying and heavy. As she reached out as if to pat my shoulder in a mock gesture of comfort, her hand slipped. The heavy red wine cascaded out of the crystal glass, a dark, jagged stain spreading instantly across the midsection of my dress. The ballroom went deathly silent. Tristan, standing just a few feet away, didn't look shocked. He looked amused. "Oh, my goodness!" Amber cried, her hand flying to her mouth in a theatrical display of horror. "I am so clumsy." "But then again," she added, her voice dropping into a sharp, cruel hiss that carried through the silence. "It's only polyester, right? I'm sure you can find another one just like it at the bargain outlet. It's not like it's real silk." She looked at the dark, wet patch on my stomach and crinkled her nose. "Actually, the stain might be an improvement. Gives the fabric a bit of character, since it clearly didn't have any before." I looked down at the wine. To Amber, it was a ruined piece of off-the-rack trash. She had no way of knowing that the fibers beneath the liquid weren't synthetic. They were woven from rare golden orb spider silk, a fabric so difficult to harvest and so labor-intensive to create that only 3 such dresses existed in the world. The simple red dress she was mocking was worth more than the Ferrari her husband had parked out front. But I didn't tell her that. I didn't try to wipe the wine away, and I didn't offer the tearful apology she was clearly waiting for. I looked up, and for the first time that night, the trauma shame was gone. In its place was a cold, crystalline clarity. I felt the weight of the 17 minutes finally come to an end. Tristan and Amber had taken everything I had given them, my dignity, my car, and now my appearance, and they had used it all to feed their own shallow egos. They were full, and now they were about to choke. "Don't worry about the dress, Amber," I said, my voice calm and terrifyingly level. "The stain won't matter in a few minutes anyway." Tristan stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. "Giving up so soon, Bree? I thought you had more fight in you than that. But I suppose when you're at the bottom, there's nowhere left to go but out the door." I didn't answer him. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen glowed in the dimming light of the ballroom as I typed a single word. I hit send and let the phone slip back into my bag. "What's that?" "Calling a ride," Tristan mocked, adjusting his cufflinks. "I hope they have a back seat for that ego of yours, because it's looking a little bruised." I looked at him, and then at Amber, and then at the room full of people who had spent the last hour treating me like a ghost. "No, Tristan," I said, stepping back toward the glass doors of the terrace. "I'm just letting my husband know that the valet parking is no longer necessary." At that exact second, the floor beneath our feet began to hum. It started as a subtle vibration, the kind you feel in your teeth before you hear the sound. Then, the crystal pendants on the chandeliers began to chime against one another, a frantic glass-on-glass warning that something massive was approaching. Tristan's smirk flickered. He looked toward the ceiling, then toward the terrace windows. The night sky outside, once filled with the distant lights of the city, suddenly went pitch black as a gargantuan shadow blotted out the stars. The 17 minutes were over. The king had arrived. The vibration didn't just rattle the glass. It settled into the marrow of my bones. It was a rhythmic, punishing thrum that grew from a whisper to a roar in a matter of seconds. Around me, the polished elite of the city froze. The mocking sneer on Tristan's face didn't vanish all at once. It eroded piece by piece as he looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of the terrace. Suddenly, the ambient light of the ballroom was snuffed out. A massive, impenetrable shadow swept across the marble floor, swallowing the golden glow of the chandeliers. The night sky didn't just darken, It turned a bruised, metallic black. The wind came next. A violent, artificial gale that shrieked against the glass before forcing the heavy terrace doors inward with a deafening crack. Guests screamed, their voices thin and high against the mechanical thunder. Tablecloths were whipped into the air, and expensive centerpieces toppled, scattering lilies and crystal shards across the floor. Amber clutched her tiara, her face a mask of sudden, panicked confusion as the sheer force of the downwash pushed the socialites back toward the bar. Then I saw it. Descending like a dark god from the clouds, a sleek, matte black military-grade helicopter hovered just inches above the stone terrace. It was an apex predator of a machine, devoid of any markings except for a small, gold dragon emblem on the tail. It didn't belong at a charity gala. It belonged in a war zone or at the center of a kingdom. The rotors created a cyclone of dust and debris, the noise so absolute it felt like it was squeezing the air out of the room. I stood at the center of the chaos, the wine-stained red silk of my dress whipping around my legs, yet I was the only one not moving. I felt the weight of the last 3 years finally lifting. Tristan had called the tow truck to remove my eyesore, but he was about to realize that the junk he had insulted was the least of his problems. Tristan's face had drained of every drop of color. He looked like a man watching his own execution being delivered by air mail. He stumbled back, his hand searching for a table to steady himself, his eyes fixed on the silhouette through the glass. The paralyzing fear in the room was almost thick enough to taste, a sharp metallic tang that replaced the smell of expensive perfume and wine. The helicopter touched down with a grace that felt predatory. The engine began to wind down, the roar subsiding into a low, predatory growl. Through the swirl of dissipating mist and dust, the door of the craft slid open with a sharp hydraulic hiss. The laughter was dead. The mockery was gone. In the heavy, expectant silence that followed, 100 pairs of eyes were fixed on the terrace. No one breathed. No one moved. They had spent the night looking down at a woman they thought was broken, but now the sky itself had opened up to prove them wrong. I looked at Tristan one last time before the figure stepped out. He was shaking, not the rhythmic tremor of trauma I had felt that morning, but the visceral, uncontrolled shaking of a bully who had just realized he wasn't at the top of the food chain. The king had arrived, and he wasn't here to dance. The hydraulic hiss of the helicopter's door was the only sound left in the world. As the steps lowered, a figure emerged from the matte black interior, cutting through the swirling mist like a ghost of vengeance. Taehyung didn't rush. He stepped onto the stone terrace with a terrifying, measured grace, his presence instantly draining the remaining oxygen from the ballroom. He wore a high-end black tuxedo, the white shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the dark, intricate ink of the dragon tattoo coiling around his throat. In the harsh, artificial light of the rotors, he looked beautiful and lethal, a king who had left his throne to settle a debt. He didn't acknowledge the elite of the city. He didn't look at the security teams scrambling into defensive positions, nor did he spare a glance for the hundreds of socialites frozen in a state of paralyzing awe. His gaze was a laser locked onto me. He walked through the shattered terrace doors, his heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the Italian marble, a sound like a heartbeat counting down the seconds of Tristan's relevance. Tristan, who had spent the last hour playing the role of the dominant alpha, was now physically shrinking. He had stumbled back so far he was pressed against a catering table, his face a pale, sweating mask of horror. The loose change he had mockingly handed me earlier seemed to rattle in his pocket, a tiny, pathetic sound compared to the mechanical growl of the beast idling outside. Tae reached me and stopped. The air around him felt different, colder, sharper, heavy with the scent of ozone and expensive leather. Without saying a word, he sank to one knee. The room gasped. The most feared man in the city, a billionaire whose name was spoken in whispers, was kneeling at the feet of the woman they had just spent 17 minutes treating like trash. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and reached out, his hand steady and large, to gently wipe the dark wine stain from my red dress. He handled the fabric with a reverence that made the cheap polyester mockery of moments ago feel like a distant, delusional dream. I told you to wait for me, Bree, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the absolute silence of the ballroom, it carried like a thunderclap. It was deep, neutral, and carried the weight of a death sentence. He looked up at me then, his obsidian eyes searching mine for any sign of the trauma shame he had seen that morning. I didn't look down. I stood tall, the red silk shimmering around me, my hand resting instinctively on his shoulder. The shift in power wasn't just social. It was visceral. The hierarchy of the room had been dismantled and rebuilt in a single minute. Tay stood up slowly, his height towering over Tristan, who looked less like a businessman now and more like a frightened child caught in a storm he couldn't control. Tay finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over Tristan with the clinical indifference of a man looking at an insect he was about to crush. You must be the ex-husband, Tay said, his voice dropping an octave into a terrifyingly quiet hum. Tristan tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. He looked at Tay's neck, at the dragon that seemed to pulse with every breath the billionaire took, and I watched the last shred of his arrogance dissolve into pure, unadulterated terror. The man who had mocked my car and my clothes was gone. In his place was a shell of a man who realized, too late, that he had spent the night insulting a queen under the protection of a god. Tae Hyung stood up slowly, the movement so fluid and predatory that Tristan reflexively stumbled back, nearly toppling a tray of crystal flutes. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the low, idle hum of the helicopter blades outside, a mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate in rhythm with Tae's heartbeat. You called a tow truck for her car, Tae said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. It wasn't a question. It was the reading of an indictment. He didn't look at the crowd, but his presence filled every corner of the ballroom. You told the guests here that my wife's vehicle was an eyesore, a piece of junk. Tristan's throat moved as he swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the terrace as if looking for an escape that didn't exist. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice cracking. It was an old car, it looked. It was a 1967 GT1 prototype. Tae interrupted, his words cutting through Tristan's excuse like a blade. One of only two in existence. I spent 3 years tracking it down for Bree because she mentioned once that she liked the curve of its fenders. It's worth $10 million on a bad day. And you had it dragged away by a grease monkey with a flatbed. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the socialites. The junk they had spent the evening laughing at was worth more than the entire fleet of Ferraris and Lamborghinis parked in the front row. Amber's hand flew to her tiara, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as she realized the magnitude of the mistake they had made. Tae didn't wait for a response. He pulled a slim, black smartphone from his inner pocket. He didn't look at the screen as he tapped it. His gaze remained fixed on Tristan, who was now trembling so violently that the ice in his glass rattled. Put him on speaker, Tae commanded into the phone. A voice crackled through the silence of the ballroom, cold, professional, and familiar to everyone in the city's financial sector. It was the head of the city's largest private equity firm. Sir, the voice asked. Coal Industries, Tae said, his obsidian eyes never leaving Tristan's. I want their entire debt portfolio. Every high-interest loan, every leveraged asset, every cent they owe to the banks. Buy it all. Now. Sir, that will cost. I didn't ask the price, Tae hissed. I asked for the ownership. The room watched in a state of paralyzed shock. In 30 seconds, the digital movement of numbers across a hidden ledger had shifted the world on its axis. The man on the other end of the line spoke again, his voice echoing in the dead silence. It's done, Mr. Tae. You now hold 100% of Tristan Cole's personal and corporate debt. He effectively reports to you. Tae tucked the phone away. The power shift wasn't just digital, it was total. He stepped into Tristan's personal space, forcing the smaller man to lean back against the marble pillar. Tay reached into his pocket and pulled out the handful of loose change Tristan had given me earlier, the coins I had handed to my husband the moment he stepped off the helicopter. He let the copper coins fall, one by one, onto the floor. They pinged against the marble, a small, pathetic sound that signaled the end of an empire. "You gave my wife bus fare," Tay whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal promise. "You thought you could humiliate her because you had a title and a suit. But now, I own the title, I own the suit, and I certainly own the car you just destroyed." Tay leaned in closer, his dragon tattoo coiling near Tristan's ear. "You mocked her car. Now you'll be walking for the rest of your life. Every time you think about taking a step, you'll remember the night you tried to make a queen feel small." He turned back to me, his expression softening into something almost tender, yet still underlined by the terrifying power he carried. He offered me his arm, ignoring the ruined wine-stained silk of my dress as if it were the most precious garment in the room. "Come, Bree," he said. "The air here has become stagnant." The silence that followed Tae Hyung's declaration was heavier than the roar of the helicopter had ever been. It was the silence of a room full of people realizing they had bet on the wrong side of history. Tristan looked small, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. As the reality of his total financial collapse settled into his eyes, Tae didn't give him the satisfaction of another word. He simply raised a hand, and two of his personal security details, men who looked like they were carved from the same granite as the helicopter, stepped forward. They didn't use excessive force. They didn't need to. They simply gripped Tristan and Amber by the elbows. Amber's tiara slipped, dangling precariously from her blonde hair as she let out a sharp, indignant cry that no one in the room moved to defend. They were led toward the service exit, the same one the valet had suggested I use, until they disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. The Alpha and his queen were gone, leaving nothing behind but the copper coins scattered on the marble floor. Suddenly, the vacuum of power was filled by the frantic chirping of the socialites. The very people who had whispered behind their hands and mocked my minimalist dress were now surging forward, their faces twisted into masks of desperate flattery. "Bree, darling, I always knew you had such a unique sense of style," one woman gushed, reaching out to touch my arm. "We should really do lunch. I'd love to hear more about your vintage collection," another added, her eyes darting nervously toward Tae. I looked at them, really looked at them, and felt a strange sense of detachment. Their apologies were as hollow as the champagne flutes they carried. I didn't feel the rush of triumph I had expected, nor did I feel the need to mock them in return. To respond would be to acknowledge that their opinions still carried weight. Instead, I simply turned my back on the ballroom. I didn't need their lunch invitations or their validation. I had outgrown the garden they were still trapped in. Tae led me back toward the terrace, his hand firm and warm on the small of my back. As we stepped into the cool night air, the wind from the idling rotors whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks. He helped me into the leather-bound cabin of the helicopter, the interior smelling of sandalwood and high-end electronics. The door slid shut with a hydraulic seal, cutting off the noise of the world below. As the craft lifted off, the Grand Lotus Hotel began to shrink. The terrace, the glittering chandeliers, and the tiny, frantic people inside became nothing more than a dollhouse. We climbed higher, the city of Seoul unfolding beneath us like a carpet of fallen stars, the Han River a dark ribbon cutting through the neon glow. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window, looking down at the glowing grid. I thought about the girl who had sat in the penthouse kitchen that morning, her hands shaking over a piece of trash. I realized then that the helicopter, the spider silk dress, and even Tae's terrifying power weren't what had made me feel strong in that ballroom. They were just tools. The true power had come from the moment I stopped looking for my reflection in Tristan's eyes. I had spent years believing his version of me, the struggling ex, the failure, the cheap imitation of a woman. But looking down from this height, I saw him for what he was, a speck of dust in a vast, beautiful world. Tae reached over, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, turning my face toward his. He didn't ask if I was happy. He just looked at me with that knowing obsidian gaze. "He's gone, Bree," he said softly. "I know," I replied, and for the first time in 10 years I actually meant it. I wasn't flying away from my past anymore. I was simply moving on to a future where Tristan Cole no longer existed. I closed my eyes and let the steady thrum of the engine carry me home, finally and completely free.